I am still reading Alaska on page 115. I'm reading from here that it says, I was still clutching Cookie's harness, trying to keep her out of it, but she loved a good fight more than anything, except perhaps eating cats, a fact that had caused some friction between Ruth, who loves cats, and Cookie. With happy growling, Cookie piled in, with which dragged the point dogs up, and they jumped into it. So 8 or 9 dogs from both teams were having at it, with me on the bottom, and I wasn't all that sure I would get out of it. Come on, gosh dang it, stop this stuff. The other musher waded in, pulling dogs off of me by jerking on the harness. Get out of there, gosh. I rolled on my hands and knees, straightened my headlamp, and found myself peering at the bearded man in the ice frozen in his beard. Sorry, he said. She had that way. Bad to start fights. She bit me. He nodded, his hand lip bobbing in the darkness. Yeah, she doesn't like anybody much. I'll hold her off. I'll hold her off to the side while your team passes. He dragged a small lead dog off into the deep snow and held her in back of him with both hands while I passed. And there came in fact many times when I would gladly have taken the small ditch who tore me apart, would have paid good money for her, would have let her eat my butt off, and swapped my soul for her. Later, miles and lives later, I sat at a checkpoint. I watched a man feeding his dogs. He could not get close to them without injury. They were half wild, yellow-eyed beasts, some with hair that hung to the ground, and they hated not just the man, not just all men, including the man who rode their sled, but all things, other dogs, trees, the world. They simply hated. While feeding, the musher had to place the food bowl when then use a stick to push the bowl where the packet dogs could reach it. In a later checkpoint, these dogs came the same dogs would catch the dogs from another team, kill it in seconds, and start eating it before they could be dragged off. And similar story that I have not been able to verify, but everybody swears it was true. It is it is said a woman was running the team in Canada, climbing into the middle of the team, fighting, and went down and was killed and partly eaten by her dogs. When I asked the sled driver how he harnessed them, he would quip it. I had a cousin help me, but he had quite before the race. But then pulled. My gosh, how those dogs pulled. I watched them leave a checkpoint just ahead of me. Saw them trum up the small mountains like a fur-covered rocket, and would gladly have suffered injury for such a team. Tugs pulling that sweet curve of power from the ganglang and up over their backs became everything. More than money, love, family, more than life, the tug. Two things had well before the race. They are of those other and combined to cause chaos. First, the absolutely numbing logistical truth of the first of the race emerge, to wit, the race taken the longest standpoint is impossible. The dogs must start in downtown Anchorage to go to downtown Nome, 1,180 miles away. They must be fed a snack every hour, rested, matured, their booties put on their feet, fed full meals every 4 hours, have their harnesses replaced, and the sled they pulled must be repaired. If they are injured, they must be flown out and seated back into the prison in Anchorage, where the convents will care for them until they are picked up. Food must be flown up, dropped at 18 checkpoints across Alaska. Also, replacement gear, booties, spare harnesses, different foods for the dogs in case they get bored with the food and need a change, which happens frequently, and was the reason why I skipped 60 pounds of turkey grizzled to each checkpoint, as in Bornos for the team, a fact that provided some merriment was word spread around Cupid with shipping food and gear. If by some incredible miracle the team would get to Nome and enter team sled dogs and gear, have created, boxed, wrapped, taped, and flown back to Anchorage. As there are no roads to drive back, and the thought of turning the dogs around and running back so dauntingly as to be unthinkable. There is, however, a story of a in-unit dog team that a man drove 600 miles from his village to run in a 400-mile race. He won the race, then turned around and ran his team home with the money prize. All of this, the enormity of the operation, the hundreds, thousands of things that needed to be done, came screaming at me at exactly the same time that a startling truth had became overwhelmingly evident. There was no more time. Somehow it had gone. The 2 months of training, the seemingly endless hours, the long days of longer nights, and mysteriously gone, and there was no more time left. And there it all happened. There was the thought that was the race approached. Things could have been furthered from the truth. Indeed, everything seemed to fall apart in frantic air dominance. Suddenly, there weren't enough booties. 600 had been made, sewn on the ancient Singer sewing machine. But the snow was bad along the trail. This meant nothing to me. I did not understand sugar snow, the regular form of crystal that is murdered on the dog's feet and required constant booties. It was sorry, I can't read sometimes. Estimate that at least 700 booties would be needed. And cloth that found in Anchorage and sewing began anew. At the same time, and the time was in incinerating exponentially. Now, the team had to be hauled to Anchorage for the vet check. Each dog had to be checked by a veterinarian to ensure he or she was in condition to run. One of the paradoxes of the race is that while extraordinary care is given to checking and caring for the dogs, as it should be, they are checked methodically before the race, examined by the vet at each checkpoint during the race, checked for drugs or other simulators, checked for proper feeding, checked for possible dehydration constantly. While every possible examination is made for the dogs, nothing is done about the musher. Nobody checks for the humans or the food they send for themselves. This has led in the past to the hereditaries as mushers running the whole race without out the change of clothes, eating only Snickers candy bars for food, and thinking one set of batteries will last them all the way. With the vet check came the need to bag supplies and ship them for the Anchorage airport, and meanwhile the sled had been virtually rebuilt with new plastic runner shoes fastened on, and every bolt lavishing examined to retightened at the same time that more booties. That's not. It's booty. The booties here. I'm just describing to you. They're shoes for dogs. I'm not saying butts. Okay. Had to be sewn, and a sled bag had to be made for the dog's food cooker, manufactured, and still more booties sewn, and more food found, and gear checked. And time was gone. In a few days, the dogs had been hauled to the Anchorage again for strategizing, and the race started. And right, the man came to the camp and looked at the dogs and shook his head. Christ, you are not going to run them like that, are you? A numbing fear gripped my heart. Immersed as I was in ignorance, I was ready to accept everybody's opinions. Why? What's wrong with them? They're full of it. You've got them tied. You've got to tie them out before the race. Tire them out? Tire them? I thought it would be just be the opposite. You'd want them to be rested. He shook his head again. How many dogs are you going to run? Rules about the dogs cover many pages. You cannot add dogs. The dogs you leave Anchorage with in harness pulling the sled are the dogs you must run. This is because the man had actually tried to run with 2 full teams, one pulling the 10 spare dogs in the cages on an enormous sled, and had proven disastrous. He had trouble making the first corner, something I would come to understand and sympathize with, and so came the rule about the dogs having to pull. The rules stare that at least 7 dogs must be on the team, and not over 20. The vicious reason moose attacks against teams and drivers were common. Dog fights should shudder injuries. People try to leave with as many dogs as possible in case they would drop some. Fly them back to the Anchorage. I had bought 20 dogs to Alaska, but after training and running in mountains, it was clear not all of them were distance or oriented dogs. I had weeded them down, found homes for those that obviously weren't going to make it. And I was going to run every dog that I thought would work. 15? I answered him. I was going to run 15 dogs. No. He shook his head one more time. You're going to run 15 dogs? I nodded. So? They are strong, tough. Heck, 3 of them on a sled will take you 50 miles a day. 15 of them on a sled in downtown Anchorage, fresh and full of pee, is a gosh dang disaster. Looking for a place to happen. You got to run them. You've got to run them. Burn them down a bit so you can handle them in town. But the race is next week. My point. He nodded. Exactly. Much evidence is given by people who have never started the race. Some of the people who have never even had dogs. It is concreted or arrogance that causes this. Simply by everybody wants so much to be involved. I did not know it at the time, but that was the case with this man. Still, in the way, he was right. I needed more control of the team. Always, but especially in downtown Anchorage, but his method was wrong. Disorientedly, I set out to wear them down. 15 dogs on a sled, slightly loaded, back to back, 60-mile run. To say that it didn't work would only be half the truth. It not only didn't work, but it exactly did the opposite effect. The team had become amazingly tough, built effect. The team had become amazingly tough. Billy effect. The team had become amazingly. What? I keep saying the same thing. Let proof. The snow conditions, good packed trails from countless teams running on them, 10 below terms, partonless, and nothing seemed to tire them. Running them 60 miles runs with good trails to tire them. The conditions and frame of my mind was like trying to put out a fire with pouring gasoline on it and mightily pumping them up. And by the time the clock ran out and everything came to a head, and it was time to head to the into the Anchorage for the start, I had what amounted the park of 15 wild dogs, absolutely full of adrenaline, and I knew it. I could feel the insanity in them. I'm not going to get out of the Anchorage alive, I told a friend. And it proved to be just about the only time I was close to being right. That's the end of Alaska. We'll get into the race, but I don't think I could read any longer. But I'll read pre-race next time, and yeah.